Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Proud. I'm the peacemonger. It is Thursday, the 12th of February in the evening. I'm delighted to be joined this evening, or this afternoon, in his case, by Anatol Lieven. He's the director of the Eurasia Program at the Quincy Institute, where I also am a non-resident fellow, thanks in large part to Anatol. So, Anatol, welcome. It's nice to have you on the show.
Great to be back.
So I thought we'd start off with, I just read today you issued if you like, a call to action for the left in Europe to kind of press for a peace deal for Ukraine. I wonder if you could start off by talking a bit about that, why you decided, why you were moved, to do that, and what its key components are.
Sure. Well, really, for two reasons. The most immediate one is that European governments, some of them, are now talking about talking to Moscow, finally, after, of course, 4 years in which they completely refused to do so, even after Trump began, his peace process. But they they're prepared to talk, but they're not actually prepared to talk about anything. Because from Russia's point of view, they have to bring something concrete, in terms of incentives, in terms of offers. And the key thing at the moment, if you want to end this war, is to get Russia to give up this demand for control of the whole of the Donbass and for exclusive control. Because that is something which it does seem, I mean, the Trump team is desperately trying to find a fudge, a diplomatic solution where you would have demilitarization, some kind of peacekeeping force, but Ukrainian sovereignty would remain. And the Ukrainians, it seems, are prepared to demilitarize, but only if the Russians demilitarize on the other side. They're not prepared to give up Ukrainian control. Now, to shift the Russians away from this demand, it's clear that the West, if the West as such still exists, has to bring something new to the table. And it seems to me that that can only be a European offer to suspend sanctions against Russia and to resume purchases of Russian energy. Now, I'm not saying that that would necessarily work, but frankly, I mean, that is something which, after a peace settlement, Europe should be doing anyway. I mean, for its own sake and for the sake of restoring, basic peace and stability on the European continent. So that is the first thing. But the second thing, which has been worrying me for a long time, and I've written about before, is the way in which the war in Ukraine and the atmosphere of emergency and danger which has been created around it is leading to partly the militarization, but more importantly, the securitization of European societies and state systems. This alleged Russian threat is being used to strengthen state control, strengthen surveillance, strengthen the demonization of critics and opponents. Indirectly, it is being used to justify much tighter police controls on speech and on demonstrations. And this is something which the left should be speaking out against anyway and should be resisting. And the left should be remembering again and again and again in European history, and North American, of course, how this kind of war fever has been used by authoritarian forces to strengthen their own control, and of course by extreme capitalist forces. So there are really two things here. The first is that we need political forces in Europe that will actually push existing European governments towards, the Europeans are determined to save what's left of their face by trying to, endlessly insisting on playing a part in the peace process. But beyond continued support for Ukraine, they have nothing actually to offer to the peace process. They could have, and they should be pressed to offer it. But I mean, an additional motive is that the left and anyone who cares about democracy and democratic control and freedom of speech should be trying to bring this war to an end in order to put a check on these, authoritarian moves in Europe.
Yeah, I agree, and of course, in the latest salvo from Kaya Kallas, I mean, she's now drawing up a list of preconditions to impose on Russia, which appear to me to be actually placing further obstacles in the way of any sort of deal between between Europe and Russia on how they coexist, after the war ends. Because I mean, I agree with you actually, and I've said it before. I've written about the need not only to have a ceasefire, but to have some normalization of relations between Russia and Europe. Otherwise, the risk is that we'll be simply pressing pause, on a much bigger war with Russia that actually involves a more militarized, Europe in the future. So I mean, I think that's absolutely right, but that appears to be absolutely the last thing that Kaya Kallas wants. I mean, she appears determined to continue the war, or she believes that actually Russia will bend to her preconditions, and I can't see that she really would believe that actually.
No, I mean, Kaya Kallas is not, a European politician or spokeswoman. She's an Estonian, and she is simply, reflecting this Baltic desire, hatred of Russia and desire for revenge against Russia. And as I've always said, you know, of the Balts and of the Poles, it's just like with somebody, an ordinary person who has suffered a crime, including, of course, some terrible crimes. Although it must be said, in the case of the Balts, much more at the hands of, the Germans and the Soviet Union rather than Russia as such. But anyway, if somebody has suffered a crime at the hands of a member of a particular national group, you have to sympathize with them on human grounds. You have got to sympathize with them, but that does not mean endorsing their prejudices against that nationality in general. Because you also have to understand, you have to understand, you can sympathize with this attitude, but you don't have to share it. And unfortunately, Callas and other Balts and Poles have, just as, by the way, the Russians warned would be the case. I mean, way back in the 90s, they said, if you take these countries into NATO and the European Union, they will try to twist these institutions in a direction of hostility to Russia, which is exactly what's happened. And other European governments, who of course do not share this full range of attitudes to Russia, but so far they have been unwilling to step out of line and condemn Callas and to draw up plans of their own. Because, and this is also, of course, a great excuse for politicians, leaders, officials in these countries, in France, in Germany, elsewhere, not to adopt unpopular lines, not to call for change. Because, as I've heard, in many conversations with them, they say, "Oh yes, yes, you're quite right. We've got to have a new policy towards Russia, and we've got to play a more positive role in the peace process. But you understand, we can't do that. We can't advocate that because what matters most of all now is European unity, and this would break European unity." So it's you need a lot of additional pressure, I think, on European governments to take a new line towards the peace process.
That's true. And I mean, we saw an example of a European member state, and it's actually extremely rare for this to happen, stepping out of consensus and making a stand on the issue of the immobilized Russian assets. And that actually wasn't from Central Europe, it was from Belgium, of course, with Prime Minister Bart de Wever. Do you see more acts of resistance like this in the future, particularly over the issue of sanctions? I mean, the risk with sanctions, I think, is not well, it is because they're ultimately self-harming to Europe more than they actually harm Russia. 12 years down the track, the risk is that the US drop their sanctions, the Europeans keep theirs, and continue to fall into economic decline at the expense both of Russia and also of the US. So
Yeah,
do you see that there's more scope for member states to actually break unanimity? I mean, unanimity has always been the thing. I mean, dating right back to 2014, that has kept sanctions kind of rumbling forward. And once that breaks, then the whole thing, of course, falls down like a house of cards.
well, I mean, the tragic thing from the point of view of the left, and that was another reason why my colleague and I, Artin Dersimonian, launched this appeal, is that at the moment it looks as if there will be governments and forces in future which will call for or institute the suspension of sanctions and the resumption of trade, it will be governments of the far right. It will be Rassemblement National in France. It will be AfD if they ever come to power in Germany. And it will not be the left. I mean, there may, of course, simply be tremendous economic pressure because it's easy to see a situation in which the US lifts its sanctions against Russia. Meanwhile, the European Union goes on banning the import of much cheaper Russian energy and buying a much, much more expensive fracked American energy.
Mm.
At which point the United States gets the best of all possible worlds. But Europe, as you say, sinks deeper and deeper into economic dysfunction.
Yeah, and it's even worse than that. It's buying more expensive American LNG at a time when US energy firms are doing joint exploration in Russia with their Russian counterparts. You know,
Yep.
it's almost like a double whammy of bizarre kind of policy choices. But I mean, I see no sign of that kind of European, consensus breaking, despite the significant economic headwinds that economies, in particular, like Germany, have faced. And I suppose my question for you is on the point about the far right parties, is that actually, are they actually worse than the kind of the liberal extremists that we have kind of running the shop now? I mean, it's an open question. I don't know, but surely it's better to have a far right party breaking sanctions consensus and normalizing with Russia than liberal extremists, stoking up tensions and nudging us closer to all-out war.
Well, I mean, I think that's why, I mean, on foreign policy, I mean, get into the potential domestic policies, but on foreign policy, um, they probably are better. Um, that is not because they are pro-Russian as such. This is a slur. It's just that they put issues of domestic stability and security, issue of migration, um, so far above anything else that the external threats to them seem minor by comparison. And of course, this is also why, for example, with regard to AfD in Germany, the accusation that they are neo-Nazis is so absolutely ridiculous. Because, of course, the neo-Nazis were, as we know, I mean, insane militarists and expansionists. And also, of course, Alice Weidel is gay and married to a Sri Lankan woman. I mean, that is not the profile of a Nazi leader. I mean, give me a break. But I had this amusing, or possibly not so amusing, conversation with a German analyst friend who said that, yes, I mean, the establishment in Germany is calling AfD neo-Nazis. But if AfD would drop its skepticism towards the war in Ukraine and NATO, and become out and out Russophobes and hostile to Russia, then precisely because they had become more like the Nazis, the accusations that they're Nazis would go right down. So you couldn't really make this stuff up, could you?
Yeah, yeah. But sadly, I mean, that is a kind of fantasy world that we seem to live in. And you're right on Callas and her Baltic disposition. But of course, she represents Europe, and actually, the Commission has a whip hand on sanctions policy, and will continue to kind of drive
Exactly.
forward, and will make the recommendations on the future of sanctions after any peace deal is settled. Including on rollover arrangements for the immobilized assets, which I believe have now legally been made permanent. In terms of the freezing of those, of those assets. So I mean she somebody from a very small, very nice but very small kind of country within Europe has outsized influence, quite frankly, over the future. And I see no scope at all for any change in the Commission position on what policy towards Europe should be. So that suggests that there will have to be some sort of unanimity breaking moment, but I don't know when that will be, given that elections in Poland, and France aren't until 2027, and of course in Germany and the United Kingdom not until 2029. I just don't know what is going to break that deadlock. I mean, what's your sense?
Well, I mean, no, I think probably. Well, I mean, hence I launched this appeal. I mean, I hope that Macron might actually, go to Moscow with something concrete, but there's no sign of it, as you say, as yet. I mean, I fear that it may have to wait until if Rassemblement National wins in France, because of course, many of the things that these right-wing parties want to do imply the weakening of the European Commission and the end or reversal of the centralization of the European Union. I mean, starting, of course, with migration and borders and free labor movement, but extending, of course, to clawing back economic powers from Brussels. It's not that these parties now want to leave the European Union, but they certainly are, strongly opposed to the Eurocratic vision of an even closer union. We don't know what that will lead to, but I mean, it will certainly lead to pushback, against Kaya Kallas, trying to claim to represent the whole of Europe. And there has been a certain amount of pushback already in certain areas. I mean, last autumn, when von der Leyen said that the European Union was, far advanced in drawing up military plans and military strategy for Ukraine, and it was quite unprecedented, really, and especially because she is, of course, German. But Pistorius, the German defense minister, came out immediately and said, "Sorry, military issues remain a national prerogative. Von der Leyen, Brussels has no right to speak for Germany on this." And of course, you will certainly have the French taking this line as well. Meanwhile, the Southern Europeans, I mean, they have these declarations, but frankly, they're just not, for very understandable reasons, very interested in what happens in Eastern Europe. They have their own priorities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was reading interesting, and it's a slight diversion from the topic, but I was reading an interesting article in Project Syndicate by a Harvard professor, I forget his name, suggesting, as you kind of hinted just there, that more, that Europe should pass more of the economic powers and competence back to member states. Which I think actually makes a heck of a lot of sense, particularly when you look at the kind of the blockage over the Mercosur deal, precisely because it's not in the interests of some member states, France in particular, but not only France, to agree to that because of the concessions they'll need to make on agriculture, and so on. But at the same time, this professor said, well, that means that Europe should concentrate more on its common foreign and security policy. And I think, well, actually, no, surely not.
Mm.
Europe became successful as a project because of in my view, I sort of say this on quite a regular basis, because of the opening up of economic links, setting aside the issue of competence and all the rest of it, breaking down barriers between states, allowing trade, interaction between peoples of different, nations across a kind of freer space, not because of the politics. It seems to me the politics has actually been the thing that has complicated and caused the turbulence within the European project, precisely because of how that impacts Europe's relations with the wider world. I mean, a strengthened common foreign security policy feels like exactly the last thing that Europe should be looking to do, even if it does, and as I think it should, devolve more economic competence back to member states. I mean, what's your view?
Well, yes, and of course the danger is that Europe will make all these commitments, makes, in the case of Ukraine, some extremely dangerous commitments. And then, of course, when push comes to shove, if there is a crisis, we'll discover that the most important members, nation states, have not actually committed themselves to this, will not send their own troops. And then, what will we be left with? We'll be left with the British, who are not in the European Union. And what exactly? So that is the huge danger. But of course, what has and I entirely agree with you. And I mean, since we're both Brits, I opposed Brexit, but I am just old enough to remember the referendum in 1973. And it's said that Britain joined the European Union through this referendum in 1973. Oh no, it didn't. It did not. It joined the European Common Market. If you had shown, I'm quite convinced, if you had shown British people in 1973 the Maastricht Treaty and what it was going to become, you would have had a huge majority against. No way are we handing this level of power to a Brussels controlled by a German with an Estonian as its as now basically the British Foreign Secretary. I don't think so. But of course, in the meantime, the euro has made a new decentralization, a return to what de Gaulle called l'Europe des patries, much more difficult, because of course, a currency is a fundamental aspect of a state. Now, the European Union is not a state, but it does have a state currency, a currency which, quite insanely in my view, it's still determined to export, whether the people of the new countries want it or not. Because, I don't know if you were able to listen in, but we had this webinar with a Bulgarian politician day before yesterday, who pointed out that, Bulgaria adopted the euro on the fiat of the government with no referendum in the population, with opinion polls showing that a majority of the population were against, and with, of course, hovering in the background, the memory, or rather not the memory, of what happened in 2008. The huge question, are the Germans going to make big sacrifices? I mean, okay, Bulgaria is not very big, but if there's another row of dominoes that look as if they're going to go down, members of the euro, just what are the Germans and the French and others going to be prepared to do to save them? So,
Yeah.
I mean, I see
I recall when the euro was established. I mean, I always thought that the fundamental difficulty was in the vastly different economic structure and scale of different members. The difference between Germany and Greece being the best example at that time of course, and we saw that through the kind of Greek
Mm.
debt crisis in 2014, sorry, 2015, in particular. And I mean, I'm not suggesting that Bulgaria is like Greece, but that fundamental structural difference between the Bulgarian economy and the German, it still remains relevant. Actually, as a humorous aside, I remember reading a telegram from Tallinn, the British embassy in Tallinn, at the time when Estonia took on the euro, and they erected a large ceremonial cow in the very beautiful and pretty centre of Tallinn city, the walled city there, and people could put in a coin, I think, a coin or possibly an old Estonian note, into, I'm not sure whether it was its backside or its mouth, one of or the other. I think possibly its backside, and get a euro out the other end, and with classic diplomatic sort of humour, the telegram finishes. I wasn't sure whether it was a good rate of exchange.
Well, but I mean, the danger is if you showed that to Germans, perhaps not in the case of Estonia, but in a number of other countries, they'd see Germany as the cow and the local people milking that cow.
Yes. Yes, well, I mean, I think if you're in Estonia or Latvia, they see it the other way in terms of German firms kind of crowding out their own firms because of their ability to kind of bring their capital in and invest and take over domestic businesses. So I mean, it's
Well, then they shouldn't have joined
I
the
don't.
European Union, should they?
Well, no, indeed. I mean, I don't. I think it'd be hard for the Germans to claim victimhood, but that's just my view. But anyway, but I mean, on this, I mean, of course, you end up with like a layered cake because Europe, you have some countries that still remain outside of the eurozone, of course, and some that are starting to sort of be dragged in, like Bulgaria. But now there's going to be an even smaller grouping in the form of the E6, which is all, I think they're all eurozone. I think the Poles still don't have the euro, do they? I don't think. But
No.
anyway, another smaller tier. Of the larger countries that want to take the big decisions, and if we move towards a more CFSP, Common Foreign Security Policy driven euro, then it's going to be Northern Europe, making all of the big calls on foreign policy. I mean, and it becoming even harder for new countries, which may not necessarily be a bad thing, like Ukraine to join. I mean, the whole system is becoming far too complex. It seems to me. But actually, in the process of that, handing more power to the Germans, the Poles, and the French.
Well, I mean, now, of course, having made this, in what initially was an absurd promise to bring Ukraine rapidly into the European Union, which means simply tearing up the acquis communautaire. Now, of course, there's all this talk of bringing Ukraine into a kind of third class membership of the European Union, in which they're in the European Union, but actually, most things they're not. Um, but nobody really knows how this will work. Is this going to mean a three-speed Europe in which other countries are relegated to the outer ring? And of course, all of this is just waiting for the next major economic crisis. And now we don't know when that will come, but in the history of capitalism, we know it will come sooner or later. And what that will do to the European Union, God knows.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And I mean, it's simply not possible. It's simply not possible for Ukraine to join, just in terms of the boring process of the matter. But by 2027, even if the war were to end tomorrow, there are just far too many chapters that are wide open with big gaps. Where Ukraine is a long way behind the reforms that it needs to carry out. Corruption, obviously, being one of them, its judiciary being, another. I mean, there's a lot of work that has to be done. But I mean that by far, in some ways, the bigger obstacle is the financial settlement around it. As actually Radek Sikorski said during that pranked phone call of 2 years or possibly 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, that actually, membership may at first only mean a flag over your buildings.
Mm.
and an ability to attend, meetings, and that's it. And I think that is what an accelerated membership may look like. Blue with gold star flags over Ukrainian government buildings and going to meetings, which frankly Zelensky does now anyway, and nothing else. There's no way in even a decade, in fact, through to 2034, that Europe will be able to kind of amend its financial settlement to include Ukraine on even remotely equal terms, if it ever does. And I suspect that it might not, because the Poles and the
And
French
that
will
is
be
going to
free.
cause, yeah, I mean, that is going to cause colossal resentment and sense of betrayal in the Ukrainian population. I don't see an unemployed, possibly wounded Ukrainian veteran being satisfied with a Ukrainian flag on a building in Brussels.
Yeah, no, quite right. I mean, they won't be, and of course, but because they have the blue flag over their buildings and they are attending the political and security committee meetings, the co-reper meetings, all the kind of many meetings, the council meetings, and all the rest of it, like the Poles and the Balts before them, they will want to influence the direction of the common foreign security policy. I think. I mean, it's quite, clear to me that they would likely to maintain that aggressive posture towards Russia, and with all the implications that has for sanctions policy in circumstances where, in any case, the commission is not inclined to kind of move the dial anyway on sanctions policy. So, I mean that. So, the prospects of actually kind of even getting to a peace to allow that to happen still, for me, feel some way down the track. I mean, what do you think?
No, I entirely agree. Uh, and that makes, yeah, I mean, that also contributes to making the future of the European Union, it seems to me, was completely open. We just do not know. And then with, of course, Trump and the uncertain future of the transatlantic alliance as well. Yeah, I think we are heading for a new and, in many ways, unpredictable world.
Yeah. So right now we're basically at a dead end, quite frankly. And you know, I mean, you have contacts, academic contacts and so on in Russia. I mean, what's the sense from the other side of the Iron Curtain in terms of, how the next kind of 6 months might play out in terms of any peace process, given that Trump has now kicked the can down the road in the hope, and I think it still is only a hope, of a resolution by June.
Well, I mean, on the one hand, all the Russians I've talked to say that Russia, or at least the Russian government, are totally nailed to getting the whole of the Donbass, and they will accept demilitarization, but they have to have Russian administrative control, and that is principally, so that they can declare victory in this war, because the liberation of the Donbass was one of the key stated reasons why Russia went to war in the first place. Um, Moscow has promised, the Donbass authorities that the whole of their territory will be, in Russian terms, liberated. To end the war without even capturing the whole of the Donbass, well, there will be furious protests from the Donbass authorities and also from Russian hawks. The West continually underestimates the degree to which Putin is under pressure from Russian hardliners, who, I mean, they are absolutely determined to get the whole of the Donbass, but they still they dream of going on to take much bigger parts of Ukraine. So I think that, Putin, looking, towards the post-war situation, is probably very worried about, how he will be able to present this war as a success to Russia when actually, of course, compared to Russian hopes when it launched the war, the consequences, aren't remotely adequate to the sacrifices that Russia has made. So you have this, it seems they've just nailed themselves to the demand for the whole of the Donbass, which is a tiny area by now. It's sort of 2,500 square miles with perhaps 200,000 people in. But at the same time, above all, because of the role of drones now in warfare, this has colossally strengthened the power of the defensive. You have this so-called killing zone, many kilometers wide on both sides, in which it is impossible to move equipment, tanks, impossible to move large numbers of troops, extremely dangerous even to move tiny numbers of troops. Now, this makes, forward movement extremely difficult and extremely costly, as we see from the fact that, despite their very considerable advantages, the Russians have been advancing so very, very slowly and at such high cost. So there is, I wouldn't exactly describe it as desperation, but there is a mood of deep anxiety, shall we say, in sections of the Russian elite, about the fact that on the one hand they are nailed to this objective, but Putin says he's confident that they will take the whole of the Donbass sooner or later. But it's, and I mean, look, if the war goes on for another 5 years, I expect that's true. But given the military record over the past year, nobody could be confident or sure of that. And, at the same time, Putin is not willing to demand much greater sacrifices of the Russian population in terms of, mass conscription, in terms of, really mobilizing the economy for war, as the Russian hardliners would like. So that's why I argue that just possibly a much bigger set of incentives from Europe and the prospect of reconciliation with Europe might, only might, move the Russians to drop this demand. If, of course, at the same time, Trump is offering all manner of fudges in terms of demilitarization and free economic zone and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an entirely kind of plausible, proposition to put forward. I just don't see the Europeans doing it. Sadly, I wish. I wish that they would do it, because I think that normalization is, in any case, absolutely vital for the longer term, peace and stability for Europe, and also, of course, for Russia, and of course, for Ukraine. But I mean, I kind of liken the situation to a bit of a chokehold where, I mean, you did a very good article in Unheard about sort of Russia's economic, condition, which, while definitely facing, headwinds, particularly in terms of inflation, and actually very, very low unemployment, which is a problem for them in terms of their industry, is in a much more resilient position than Europe, and of course, Ukraine. And in terms of the relative weights, economic weights of both sides of the line of contact, Russia is in a better place and can afford to wait it out for another year, 2 years, even if it's only making microscopic advances on the front line. I mean, that doesn't really matter. I mean, in terms of the way I understand the Russians, from their perspective, the Ukrainians and actually their sponsors, which are effectively now only the Europeans, because the US are no longer kind of providing substantive kind of financial aid, will run out of money, and actually, in the case of Ukraine, men, to keep fighting, and will need to kind of settle on even worse terms than those available today. So, I mean, I think that
Well,
is Putin's gamble.
you're absolutely right. That is his gamble. But the thing is, at the same time, you at that point you have to keep the war going. You have to tell the population that it has to make increasing sacrifices in terms of standard of living. You you either have to raise much more money to pay the soldiers, which is inflationary in itself, or you have to basically tell the soldiers, well, we're terribly sorry, but your pay is going to be eroded by inflation. Now, this is a volunteer army, um, heavily incentivized by pay, and given the, I mean, I don't believe the Western, let alone the Ukrainian estimates of Russian casualties. And the idea that the Russians are losing 7 for every 1 Ukrainian, I think, is nonsense. But the attacking side always loses more heavily than the defense in a war of this kind. And, drones, they haven't completely, well, drones have neutralized the Russian tanks. And they have actually pushed Russian artillery a long way back because, stationary artillery pieces can also be located and destroyed. And if this goes on and the Russian gains continue to be minimal, I mean, people in Russia can read a map, and I mean, either you basically you level with the people and say, look, we're just going to keep this going. We're not going to try to advance. We're going to wait them out. You have to buckle down and wait for a political transformation in the West. Maybe, but that's that's also a gamble. And of course, if the Russians wait 2.5 more years, you have the American elections. You could have the Democrats coming back, and then of course you could have America going back to full support for Ukraine. At which point, chances of Russian victory would evaporate. So, there is also a time constraint on the Russians.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. As well. I mean, one of the key pieces of this puzzle as well that we haven't spoken about so far, of course, is NATO, and I think if if we get to a point where Europeans are willing to kind of think about how they structure some sort of normalization with Russia, which I think is absolutely kind of sensible and helpful in terms of a future peace. I mean, for Putin himself, having NATO taken off the table will be a massive strategic victory, far bigger than gaining another few kind of towns in Kramatorsk and so on in Donetsk. I mean, that is a huge prize. When you talk about in your articles, about him needing to kind of sell this as a victory, that alone is a massive victory. I mean, that is the reason, that he used to justify this war. To prevent NATO's further eastward expansion, and he succeeded. Okay, you can talk about Finland and Sweden joining, but I think that the Russians are always far less fussed about that in circumstances where they were kind of largely interoperable with NATO anyway. I mean, Ukraine out of NATO is a massive victory for the Russians, and it's important that that is front and center somehow in the negotiations, because you never really hear it discussed these days when we're talking about land swaps and security assurances and that sort of thing. The NATO piece seems to have disappeared out of the discourse, which, if I'm being honest, makes me slightly nervous.
Well, I mean, NATO membership has, Trump has said long ago that he doesn't think Ukraine can ever be in NATO. But of course, the Europeans have colossally muddied the waters with this proposal for a European reassurance force in Ukraine with a US backstop, which, from a Russian point of view, is just as bad as NATO membership. It brings NATO troops into Ukraine, and it could commit them to Ukraine in the case of a new war. I mean, what the Russians want, of course, is an actual treaty
Mm.
with the US, ideally with NATO as well, ruling out any further NATO expansion. And they're prepared in return to offer no further expansion of their obviously far, far weaker and looser security bloc, the CSTO. But that would be extremely difficult to get through the Senate, the US Senate, and impossible to get through, all the members of NATO, every one of whom has a veto. But without that, you see, I mean, the problem is that Western leaders say again and again, oh, but we can't trust the Russians. Why on earth should the Russians trust us? I mean, especially because everybody now knows that a new US administration, I mean, given what Trump did and Bush before him, can tear up everything that the previous administration did, can just junk treaties. So you see, I mean, I'm sure that Putin can put this across to the population as a great victory, but serious Russian analysts and including hardliners who will say this very loudly will be much more dubious about this unless this can be really nailed down. And I mean, and that's why it's so important that the European countries restore relations with Russia, restore economic relations, drop sanctions, because clearly something that's critical for the Russians and is this whole business which Trump is offering of a completely new economic relationship between Russia and the United States. That is a huge incentive, but it's got to have the Europeans on board as well.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. Yeah, I mean, Europe is the big sticking point here, and as I think I've sort of written about, as well. For as much as they have excluded themselves and actually taken themselves out of any involvement in negotiation towards a peaceful settlement of this terrible war in Ukraine, they are actually vital to the negotiated outcome because the decisions that they take, will have massive consequences for whether any peace sticks. So while there, in particular, people like Callas, interventions have been maddening, frankly, in actually seemingly blocking any chances of peace. Actually, we do need them to play a constructive role in the process at the table, even if that's just at the table directly with Russia in terms of how they navigate their off ramp, from the war, rather than actually Russia's off ramp with the Ukraine that's being negotiated with the Americans, of course. So yeah, no, we need the Europeans, but yeah. I'm skeptical that we're going to make much progress anytime soon. I mean, it's taken them 6 months still not to agree who's going to talk to Putin. So,
Well, I know, and as I say, they're now finally admitting that yes, you probably ought to talk to the Russians, but as I say, they don't have anything to talk about.
yeah, no. Well,
So,
I mean, that was the point I was making. If it takes them that long to agree who's going to do the talking, how long will it take them to agree the agenda and actually what specifically that they can offer as a starting point for negotiation with the Russians on the shape and scope of any normalization should it take place and how that sequences in with the end of the hostilities, of course, themselves. I mean, it's a massively, from a diplomatic point of view, it's a hugely complex thing. And when there's been absolutely no engagement for over 4 years, there are no relationships there. Uh, there's no structure there in terms of navigating the complex negotiation of texts and boring stuff like that, which is still vital to processes like these. It's hugely complex, and even if they started now, it could take a year. And I met Andrei Kalin, the Russian ambassador, a while ago, and he said, well, just on the peace, just on the ceasefire deal, it could take 6 months starting, from whenever it starts to negotiate a treaty on what the ceasefire with Ukraine might look like. So yeah, massively complex, and So the work that you've done, your letter, was hugely important in starting a conversation about the need for parties, both on the left, but also, of course, on the right, to actually engage with their governments to encourage constructive engagement in negotiations to bring this whole thing to an end. Because, yeah, for as long as the Europeans stay out of it, and actually that effectively remain a party to the conflict, through their actions or through their inaction, then we will not get any closer to a peace in Ukraine, which is tragic, in fact. So thanks, Anatol. That's been a fabulous discussion as always. I hope people have found it as thought provoking as I certainly have, and interesting. Please do like and subscribe if you did, to support my work promoting the cause of peacemongering around the world, wherever you are in the world. I wish you very much peace. And Anatol, thank you so much for taking the time to talk today.
Thanks a lot, Ian, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Yes, thanks.